I am Michael Robbins with Crowley and Cummings, and thankfully, and I'm very appreciative, I've got Fred Leonardo with me. He's the Westboro Building Commissioner. I can't tell you how excited I am to have him here. I've been doing this talking lunch and learn for some time, and it's absolutely fantastic to have an authority with me today. I want to thank you all for coming. I've been practicing residential real estate exclusively for over 17 years. I'm licensed in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Florida. I'm also an authorized title agent for New Hampshire and Maine. My firm, Crowley and Cummings, is one of the largest real estate conveyancing firms in New England. We really pride ourselves on being agent friendly and working when you do. I always say, business comes at us all the time, and we have to take that business when it comes to us. And I've worked with some of you here in the room today, and they'll know that I mean what I say. A lot of times questions specifically about permits come up during weekends. There might be questions about putting together an offer with some potential issues. Call me. I'm going to be leaving my information with my flyer, with my contact and information, and the number I give out is my cell phone. That is the number I want you to call me on. I always joke, I go, if you don't want to speak to me, you can call the office. But if you want to speak to me, call me on my cell, because I really try to make it as flexible and as easy, so that way you can get your houses under agreement and sold as quickly as possible with as little obstacle to that as possible. And I was just talking to Fred about how this talk came about. 3 years ago, no one is talking about building permits. No one. This is a non-existent issue 3 years ago. Within the last 2.5 to 3 years, this is a constant issue. This is part of almost every purchase and sale negotiation, and this is becoming a real obstacle to parties coming together. And I'm dealing with what I've found to be a couple of major issues with respect to building permits. One of them is from a listing perspective. Listing agents historically have said, listen, if there's a problem, I don't want to know about it because I have to disclose it, and I'm just going to see if the buyer kind of brings this up, and we'll kind of deal with it as it comes. I think that's gone away. I think we've lost that ability to stick our head in the sands with respect to any issues. I am having deals lost regularly because there were unpermitted or non-closed out permitted items. Seller lists their house, the buyers check, there's all this unpermitted work, deal blows up. Specifically, I just had a deal in Grafton not 3 months ago, under agreement at purchase and sale. The current owner they'd purchased the home 3 years ago. There was a completely renovated and finished basement. They had not checked for open permits. The buyers did. Those of you who know Grafton well know Bob Berger. Bob Berger is a personal friend of mine. I was on the Grafton Zoning Board for 5 years. But Bob Berger, if he was here, I'd say it right to him, and it'll be on tape. He can be a hard ass. But at least Bob is consistent and is consistent in his approach and his application. And I'll tell you, in Grafton, if there's no permits of record, permits weren't pulled. There are times when there are no permits of record, and we don't know if permitted work was done or not. Grafton is really militant about their permitting process, and they knew that basement had not been permitted, and Bob required additional work to get done, including insulation, including a fire door, and some additional items. That deal blew up. Guess who, because I was representing the seller, they go, how do we sue our former agent for not checking this? Where do we think this is coming? This is coming right to you. The idea that you can now list a property without checking for open permits and addressing this, I just don't think we can run that anymore. I just don't think that holds water anymore. From a buyer's perspective, there's no question. You need to be checking. A lot of us here have been trained, we don't want to be the source. Don't want to be the source. I don't want to miss something and then be responsible for that. But the flip side is your buyers are relying on you to be a professional agent and to be checking these items. If you just say, oh, it's up to the buyers to check, who do you think they're really going to blame if they buy a house and there's open permit items? You're representing that you're their buyer's agent. I suggest you either go to the town together and check the records together. Alternatively, you go to town hall, you pull the records, you have your camera right here. Open the folder. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is what I've found. Please check these as well, just to make sure we're not missing any items or documents. I just want to stay on listing side for a second. The listing side, checking for permits isn't discovering issues. You're already bringing value to that listing appointment. You're going to be able to go there. They're going to interview you, and you're going to say, hey, listen, Fred, I went into your, I'd love to list your house, but I noticed that there was 2 open building permits that I think we might need to get addressed and closed out. Most building permit issues are not going to be a disaster. Most are going to be a siding permit that wasn't closed out. Oh, a hot water tank heater that they had to replace and need a final inspection on. They might need a roofing permit closed out. Those are going to be a majority of those issues. And then you're able to provide that to that seller, that homeowner. Oh my God, I forgot about we needed to close out that siding permit. I had a seller rep for Framingham. They had 9 open permits. But 7 of them were for over 20 years ago. Nope, building commissioner was like, nope, we're going to close. Those are all set. I'm not worried about those. Let's get those 2 permits closed out. I was the one that raised that issue. So we're at purchase and sale. The buyer's attorney, and we're going to go over some purchase and sale language, was like, we want the seller to close out any and all open permits and is going to warrant this post-closing. This provision shall survive the closing. Well, in that case, it was 2 easy permits to close out. But let's say it's a substantial renovation. Now you've got an open item in a contract that's going to survive the closing. Guess who's going to get dragged back into that issue? You don't think you're going to get a phone call from that 2 years from now? We've got to stop this now. One of the other things that my office provides, and I'll hand you the flyers, we've designated a specific email address for RE/MAX. You can email my office. Please CC me, because I always like to try to track things. I call my files my little eggs. And so I try to keep a track of my little eggs. But what we do is we do a single owner rundown from a title perspective. Most of the time it's like, oh, you have a mortgage that we need to be paid off. But our closing times, 15 years ago, I had 60 days at least to do a closing. Now I've got 30 at best. I'm thrilled with 30 days practically now. The times are too tight. And so I love when I call people, I get my title back 2.5 weeks later and they go, why am I just learning about this now? I'm like, because I only have 30 days to do everything. So if you can get ahead of that and say, oh, we can see that there's a missing execution on title, again, you're able to go to that listing appointment armed with any permit information as well as any current owner. This isn't a full title search. It's just a current owner search. So if there's a prior owning missing discharge or item, that won't be addressed with that single owner rundown. But this way, you go there and you say, hey, listen, just so you know, we did a single owner rundown search of your home, and there's this missing release that we need to get. And that's another talking point. It's just not, oh, here's my information about what I do in market analysis. Nope, I've already checked the permits. I've already checked the title. You're doing that additional work. You're bringing more resources and value to that listing. Before I forget, kind of off subject, in addition to permits, but super important, any of those, especially if you're dealing with any multifamily properties, I see this happen a lot. The tax assessor will have it listed as a 3-family. That is not a legal designation. You cannot rely on the tax assessor's database as for legal occupancy and use. And if you're selling a 3-family that really looks like a 2-family with a bonus apartment, you better check that. We need to get that before you list that property. You really want to make sure we know what we're listing. It sounds simple, but like, oh yeah, the tax assessor's got it as a 3 or a 4. I do a lot of work in Worcester, and there's a lot of bonus apartments. Ashland, a lot of bonus apartments. And we really want to, again, let's sink our teeth into those listings. And so instead of looking away from potential problems, kind of embrace it and get ahead of it, because it's easier for us to control because we know about it. What we don't want to have the listing agents do is wasting their time, resources, and energy, get a listing only to have it die on the vine at purchase and sale about permits. And it's really becoming an issue. I had 2 purchase and sales come into my office today, like, hey, Mike, please review this, I've got the seller. Both of them will have permit language that I think is really unacceptable, and so I want to talk about that. Again, really just trying to focus on not wasting your time. If there's an unpermitted basement, like this happened in Shrewsbury, this gorgeous $50,000 renovation, there's no permits on that. And they had to close those out, and that's a significant amount of funds. That's going to change the entire dynamic. Fred helped me out on this, but a lot of the issues can be addressed simply. Are there going to be some chronic ones? Like I've got someone like, oh yeah, they built this deck completely illegally with no permits. That's a different set of circumstances. But for a lot of permit issues, I think that these can be closed out and you can look really good relatively easily. You know, so it's just a situation where the building commissioner is not the boogeyman. And Bob, as tough as he is, right, for those of you who know Grafton, I always say, hey, Bob, do you need a snack or, a soda? Like, let's go talk through this. And Bob's a great guy. Like, I'm lucky to have worked with him on a professional basis in the building department because I got to understand him one-on-one, which is super helpful. And a lot of these towns have different rules and protocols, and Fred knows this. Different commissioners have different priorities and different things that they want, and it's always important to communicate, and so then that way we're, again, working together to resolve issues instead of waiting them to boil over. Like I said, for the buyer's agents, this is a must-do. Like some seller's agents like, I am not looking, like, don't want to know. I don't care what Mike says. But for the buyer's agents, I think there's no escaping this. And the idea that you can't be the source, I just really struggle with that. You're just going to town hall, you're checking the records. If you just document it and take photos, well, that's all I have. That's all. I couldn't have missed something. Could you have missed something? Sure, you could have, but this is what I had, and please check this. Yeah, again, the liability. Okay, this is the challenge right here. Is town records are inconsistent. And the absence of a building permit does not mean one was pulled. And I live in Southborough. I just moved there 3 years ago. I built a barn that's essentially like a small house. I call it Michael's Folly, AKA Michael's Mini Money Pit. I built this, got a structural permit for the construction, underground electrical, plumbing. I pulled all of those permits. I was there for the underground electrical permit inspection, for the plumbing inspection. I'm also on the town zoning board in Southborough. There was a hearing about a barn that had been built 15 years ago. The permits had all expired and they needed to close them out. And they needed a special permit and a variance for the height. And I go, I'm just going to go to town hall and check to see what permits are still open, if any, on my barn. There are no permits. Nothing. Not for the structural, not for the plumbing, not for the electrical. If I hadn't held on to that field card, and Mark Robidoux, our current building inspector, he's taking a position in Lincoln. Let's say I had waited 7 or 8 years go by, and I go to sell my house, and they go, Mike, where are the permits for that barn? We need to see them. They're not there. They were non-existent, and I was there for those inspections. And so you have a situation as a buyer's agent, you go, well, wait a minute, how can we advise our buyers? They're buying this house. Let's use me as an example. We want to buy this house. You have literally a second home in the backyard with plumbing and electrical. There's no record of a permit whatsoever. Well, I pulled every permit. And they go, well, you need to get those. I'm not going to do that. No. I'm not getting permits for everything else that I've already done. And so I call it ringing the permit alarm. If you have a buyer and a buyer's agent, and you start going, ding, 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 oh, they don't have permits for this whole barn. They couldn't have done this without permits. The issue was the inconsistent record keeping at Southborough. It's not that I didn't do it. I was there for those inspections. But if the buyer's agents and the buyers create a firestorm, tell me how I can put that out. I'm going to pull all new permits for an existing structure, an existing wiring. Am I going to have to dig a trench and have them re-inspect the electrical conduit? I mean, Jim Cleary is a great electrical inspector, but he's not going to be doing this for much longer. So if I lose those personal connections, maybe the next inspector is going to be like, well, I can't see what was done and I'm not going to sign off on it. Now we're stuck. This is the issue. The inconsistent record keeping from Westboro, Shrewsbury. What's that?
Thank you for that.
No, but Fred's the new sheriff in town. But this is the issue. Shrewsbury is probably one of the worst as far as record keeping. And I cannot tell you the issues that have resulted from buyers and their agents ringing a permit alarm that I can't put out. You've got a deal falling apart for things that no one can fix. I've renovated, this just happened, Shrewsbury, 2-year-old roof. The buyers were insistent that they show us proof of building permits. And I go, the buyer's attorney was a woman named Sarah. I go, Sarah, it's Shrewsbury. If it's not in the file, it doesn't exist. I go, we can't prove to you if they don't have it in their system. They lied. This is all BS. There's no permits for this. The town was like, if we have to do this, they were insistent that they would have to go inspect the roof, which is to me kind of unheard of and over the top. But I was on the phone calls, and they're like, nope, we're going to inspect and make sure it's ice and water. And I was like, you're going to check making sure all the nails are done? Like, I'm giving them a hard time, but like, really, are we going in this direction? And if it wasn't for the homeowner who went through all of their receipts and records to find the signed and closed out permits, and the buyers and the buyer's attorney were unbelievable. They couldn't believe that the town didn't have the records, but they didn't. So what we have is a situation, let's stick it back to Southborough and me. You have a buyer that comes to look at my gorgeous house, by the way. Beautiful barn. No permits. There's just no permits available. What do we do now? We have to have a conversation and say, okay, Fred, you want to buy the house. We don't see any permits for this. The seller, let's ask them if they have any records. At every single closing I do, seller rep, buyer rep, I say the same things. The days of begging for forgiveness instead of asking for permission are over. That used to be the case with a lot of building permits. Like, I don't want to pay the taxes on my new jacuzzi. Like, whatever it is, that's gone. That's gone the way of the dodo. I think that this issue, this permit issue, is going to time out in just a couple years. And what I mean by that is the towns are already doing online permitting. They're going to have more detailed records available. and this issue is going to go away. But right now, this is a crucible. Deals are being lost over this issue, and it has to be addressed, I think, at inception. If the listing agent knows about it, we can start working on those issues. If we can't find anything, it's Southborough. We can't fix it, can't find those permits. Let's have a conversation. And then the buyer needs to be disclosed, hey, we checked these records. We know Southborough's got some not so great record keeping. What do you, Fred, want to do? Do you want to buy this house? And as agents, we need to protect ourselves. You need to say, Fred, we discussed this. You wanted to move forward with buying the house without those discovery of those permits? That's in an email. Because we all know that conversation is forgotten or misinterpreted. And I cannot tell you how many times I've slept comfortably at night when I say, please see email dated March 26, 2015 about how I told you that this was going to be a problem. Good night. And I can be a little bit more ruthless because I'm that way. But at the same time, I think it's really important that we cover ourselves from liability, because I've gotten 2 phone calls within the last 3 months about, one in Westboro, one in Grafton, about wanting to pursue action against agents for not checking on permits and not addressing this right out the gate. So this is ground zero right here. So if you don't think it's an issue, we're mistaken. Let me see. Fred, anything that you're like, Mike Robbins does not know what he's talking about, or anything that you're like, yeah, no, don't do that, do this?
No, so far Mike's pretty close on most things. I don't see any great discrepancies.
So when is a building permit, and this is kind of the key. I don't expect everyone here to know what the Mass building codes are. The things that are, for me, threshold items that are easy are finished basements. You see a 1950s Cape with a brand new finished basement. Okay, let's look for, we want to make sure that this is permitted work. Finished attic. Anything that resembles what I call either a Laverne and Shirley apartment or a Fonzie apartment. For those of the correct age, those are accessory dwelling units. Laverne and Shirley were in the basement. Fonzie was above the garage. For those younger of not my youth. But those, if I walk into a house and I see an accessory dwelling unit, what do we got here? Let's work on this. Any gas-related issues? Oh, they've got this new patio, gorgeous patio with a gas, a hard gas line to that patio, and there's no permits on that. Again, those are the big situations where, that can blow. Literally, we know that firsthand, that those events happen. That's not an abstract. The electrical service panel. You see a brand new service panel, fully updated, and there's no electrical permits. Those are really some items. And another item that I do want to touch base on, because it is new for all of us, relatively speaking, is solar panels. Boy, let's get on the same page with solar panels, because there's potentially some title issues. Some solar companies are great at releasing their UCC liens or some of their financing agreements. Some are really slow. So if you have a listing that has solar panels, we want to also look for permits for the work done. But in addition to that, we really want to make sure our timetables are more realistic, because now we're subject to a third-party control. And like I said, some solar companies are really great, and I can get a UCC release in a day. Others, I'm still chasing. And there's a dynamic with solar panels. Any other flashpoints for permits from your vantage point, Fred? Like something that concerns you from a home that was looking for permits?
Well, yeah, but that gets into a little bit, if you want me to go on, it'd take me more than a minute.
No, that's okay.
All right, so let me let me just correct a couple things. First of all, Mike said something about me being an expert. He used that term very loosely, so just remember that. And anything I say is pertinent to Westboro. So most commissioners are gonna be very similar, and I've worked in a couple other communities. But if I say something, it only is germane to Westboro. And one of the reasons I came here, because you're a neighboring community, so I assume that you might come into Westboro someday. So I'll speak to specifically about what goes on with Westboro. A lot of things that Mike touched upon were right on. I've actually had realtors come into the office, not just in Westboro, but in previous or other communities I've been into. And that's been going on for a while, actually. It's not in the last couple of years. I've seen it go on for a number of years. Some realtors are better about that than others. So they'll come into our files and see if there's open permits. A few of the permits you really want to be aware of, as Mike indicated, basements, attics, and accessory dwelling units. So the definition of accessory dwelling units varies from community to community. Westboro, it's called an accessory dwelling unit. It's referenced like a in-law apartment. So those are very critical because there's a lot of life safety issues that can go into an accessory dwelling unit. Some towns will allow them to be rentals, some won't. So there's some zoning components of those as well. But the key to that is if you're advertising a building or a house as having an au pair or an accessory dwelling unit, you want to make sure that in fact it is. Because a lot of times, I don't want to say those happen illegally, but they're not always permanent, so that's a big one. Basements, so all the things that Mike has alluded to actually happens in real life. I actually had a closing within the last couple months that had an accessory dwelling unit. It was initially done correctly, but there was some zoning issues, so that couple, before they ended up closing, had to go back to the zoning board of appeals and get some things straightened out. But we were able to work through those issues. So a lot of times the commission will work with you on that stuff. Yes, we can be pains in the butts, I get that. But to be honest with you, it's good for your clients too. It's always good to get the permits too, because we're here for life safety and for the benefit of the homeowners. So, we're trying to work with you on that. As far as closing things out, generally, again, in my community or in communities I work in, we don't do destructive inspections. So if the work's been done and it wasn't appropriately inspected through all the roughs and various stages of the permit, unless there's something that looks grossly wrong, we're not gonna normally go in there and tell you have to rip it apart. We've minimally done that over the years, but not often. It's only if something's glaringly wrong. So those are good things to keep in mind. But I've had several basements and or attics have to come back. If we don't have records on it and we can't prove when they were put in, we would have them pull a new permit. And then again, we would go in, do the inspections as best we can. We would generally make some notes on it that there were visual inspections. We didn't do a destructive inspection. So there's not too many communities that won't work with you, I would think, to some regard on that. But it's always good to go back in the files. As Mike alluded to, Westboro, we've gone to online permitting. We actually have electronic database for old permits. But believe it or not, we do lose permits. I mean, that does happen. I know it's hard to believe, but it happens in every community. Sometimes the paperwork will get lost. It's another reason, if you're talking to your clients or whatnot, to remind them to keep the paperwork. So generally what I tell our customers when we sign off on a building permit card, that they keep that card, so there's some proof that inspections or a permit had been pulled at some point. You also might want to remind them too, if you're dealing with anybody that does additions or any remodel for that matter, that they get a certificate of occupancy. That's a big thing too. So if you get that certificate of occupancy, the town has then released the permit and said, yeah, the work has been done to some kind of standard, whatever that may be. So some of that when Mike's done, I just want to kind of open up to questions because sometimes it leads to other questions. So I can drone on and on about permitting because I love permitting, but yeah.
What if somebody just wants to update their bathroom? They're not putting a new bathroom in, but they're doing tile, replacing shower, tub, toilet.
Okay, so plumbing's very good. In the state of Massachusetts, you're not allowed to do your own plumbing without a licensed plumber.
Right.
Outside of replacing, I think you can replace a washer or whatnot. There's some minimal repairs that you can do legally, but generally, if you're doing a like-in-kind replacement, so this is true for bathrooms, kitchens, you don't need a building permit per se, but you need at least a plumbing permit and/or an electrical permit. Now, again, the caveat is it's a like-in-kind replacement, so somebody comes in and pulls your cabinets off your wall and puts brand-new cabinets, that's okay. But more often than not, people say, they'll say, we're just gonna pull the cabinets off. Well, that's okay, but next thing you know, they're opening up your floors, they're opening up walls. So the caveat is like in kind, you're not opening things up. Once you start to open things up, then all bets are off, you need a building permit. So minimally, if you see a kitchen or a bathroom that's been remodeled, you wanna find out to what extent it's remodeled, but you at least should see a plumbing inspection, or permit, I should say, and/or an electrical. Once you see that, then generally, if the plumbing inspector goes in, they'll make an assessment to whether they think a building permit should be there. Obviously, if you walk in, there's no drywall anywhere, there should have been a building permit, so we can usually recognize that. Yes?
So if I'm hiring someone to redo my kitchen, who is responsible for getting those permits?
Well, it should be your contractor.
Right, so I'm to trust them and
No.
follow up with them. Right.
No.
Exactly, so I'm hiring them, I don't know, I got 4 kids and I don't have time to chase this. As a consumer, do I then have to, how do you know that you're supposed to do that?
Well, so there's, over the years, some of the watchwords you'll get is if the contractor says to you, well, one, if they say you don't need a permit, that's usually a sign that you're in trouble. 2, if you don't see a physical card of some sort. So, you don't have any responsibility, you're getting, well, I should say that, but as a homeowner, you're trusting that the contractor you hire is doing that. So there's a few things that can happen. You can check with your local municipality. I can't speak for Hartley, I'm not sure, but for instance, with Westboro, you can actually go online now and search our records. So anything in the last year or so, you can easily tell if there's a permit on it. You don't even have to register with our site. You can go to the town of Westboro, click onto our link, our hyperlink, and go right there and look up your address and see if there's a permit on it. It'll tell you whether it's closed, what the status of it. You can see when the inspections were done. So as a whole, what I would suggest if you're talking to your clients, minimally find out from the contractor if they pulled a permit. If they tell you yes and they don't show you any evidence of that, they're probably lying to you. I know it's hard to believe, but they're probably not truthfully on that. The last thing too on is, we don't always issue certificates of occupancy for interior remodels, but by statute, we can and will. So you should ask, and to be honest with you, I'd suggest you don't make final payment until you actually see that document.
I was waiting for that.
That's probably your strongest thing, is that if you get what's called a certificate of occupancy, that means that the work has been completed and is code compliant to the best of the inspector's ability. Now, if you're doing a like-in-kind replacement with plumbing and electrical permits, you're not typically gonna see that. You're not typically gonna see a certificate of occupancy. They're usually associated with a building permit. But you can still, don't be afraid to have your customers or yourself call that department. You'd be surprised, I know again, you're gonna find this hard to believe, but I'll have customers occasionally call me and say, contractor said don't call you because you're gonna be annoyed. No, they're telling you that because they're probably not doing something they're supposed to be doing. I'm never annoyed by a customer calling me and asking me these type of questions.
So again, this is sort of like what should have happened when we did the work. So
Absolutely.
let's say that you're taking a listing, there are no permits. Now what do you do to take the listing and to clear up what isn't there?
Well, I guess
Like
it depends
fix
on from my perspective, it depends on what the issue is. As
Right.
Mike alluded to, roofs, we get that often. The problem with roofs.
No
well,
gas hot water tank permit pulled.
Well, so that could be an issue too from a plumbing standpoint, because you have to be careful that it's plumbed correctly. And so if you have some kind of fly-by-night company that came in and put that in, or you had a homeowner do it, there's nothing to prevent them. Legally, they're not supposed to do it. That doesn't mean, Home Depots, Lowe's, they all sell that equipment, so there's no way for you to know that it's been done legally. So oftentimes, especially if it's a new water heater or appliance, gas appliance, whatever it may be, if it's been done in the last year or so, generally anywhere in central Mass, they're gonna have some record of that. And I would be suspect if they don't have a plumbing permit. And if it's not, worst case scenario, you can hire a licensed plumber to pull a new permit
Okay.
and/or inspect the work.
Okay, so they could do that.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And minimally, if you see something new and there's no proof that it's been done correctly, it's always a watchword to go back and have it done. I mean, it doesn't mean that every time you see a new house, you're gonna say, well, everything's gonna be done, you know, just like Mike kind of alluded to, but. Photoelectric is kind of an interesting thing too. We mentioned that. We've kind of changed our mode of how we inspect those now. It used to be the electrical inspector go in, and some of the solar companies were very good about getting the building departments to sign off on those, some of them weren't. So we've done the inspections in reverse. We usually go out and do the building inspection first and then the electrical second. And the reason I say that, because from my understanding, and there could be situations where I'm wrong, but for the most part, those systems can't be turned on without inspections. The utilities are pretty good about that from my understanding, so they won't actually turn the whole system on until they know that the local municipality's done inspections. So that's a good thing from our perspective. That was it, again,
What
you know,
about like a simple gas stove? Like you buy it, you have a plumber come and hook it up for you.
yes,
You need a permit for that?
yes.
How about your dishwasher?
Well, yeah, technically you do, but dishwashers are kind of, they're a little bit tougher because most of it's plug and play. So usually you're pulling out a hose that exists in a outlet that actually plugs in, not hardwired.
Correct.
So dishwashers may not typically get
I mean, so there's
a
always a
permit.
thing, is, okay, like questions, the dishwasher's brand new, whether they got a permit for it?
Generally, if it's not hardwired to something, it's not as critical. Not to say you
I won't know
shouldn't get
that
it.
unless they pull the dishwasher out.
Yeah, but very few dishwashers say that. I don't believe a lot of dishwashers are necessarily hardwired, and they're not usually going to a gas appliance. Anything with gas, I'd always be suspect to that,
Yeah.
because it is supposed to be done by a licensed gas fitter.
Yeah.
A lot of them, you know, they're putting in a new stove and they're gonna get a gas fitter. Well, maybe not, but they really should. Usually whoever you're buying it from should be knowledgeable about that. Most homeowners aren't gonna touch their own gas, I hope.
You would hold.
I would hope,
We got
but,
it once, didn't go well.
yeah.
Do you want to continue and then we'll do questions?
Yeah, so because what'll happen is these items just keep coming up, and I really value that, but at the same time, you know, that's something that I'm happy to address afterwards for a little bit of time for that. But just to kind of follow up on just a couple of the points that were mentioned is what I do now with the experience that I've just had as a homeowner in Southborough. I've had the hot water tank replaced, and they're literally, it was a reputable plumbing company. He's like, listen, do you want us to pull a permit? But if we do, we're going to charge you extra for that because it's additional time. And they were kind of like downplaying it, like you don't need, and I'm like, no, need it. But what happened is in Southborough, they installed it, but I needed to call the town to conduct the inspection, and I was unaware of that. And so it's tough because those contractors, you're relying on them. And to Fred's point, I say now, listen, no final check until I have a final signed and closed out permit in my hand. At every closing, I say you need to pull the permit, you need to close the permit, and you need to keep the permit. I did new construction, and we got the certificate of occupancy. And I go, you see this? I go, I've made a copy of it. I go, your deed's going to be at the registry of deeds. I go, you know, people always like, oh, I want my deed, I want my deed. I'm like, no, this is what you want. This is your gold. And I go, you want to hold on to that golden ticket because this is a record. And I say, I've already sent this to you in a scanned copy, but you want to make sure you keep that record. And Fred, I want to tread very lightly on this, but I do want to talk about old work without permits. Fred, make sure you kick me if I say anything that you would disagree with, but typically, generally speaking, if there had been work 15 years ago done on a house, I'll use my old house in Grafton. There was the 1950s Cape, and they had built an additional deck. When? I don't know. I literally bought the house at foreclosure auction. And I remember when I was selling the house, they go, hey, there's no permits for this deck. And I go, well, listen, I think that that deck is more than 10 years old. And I go, I took out the house 5 years ago. I had actually looked at the house the year before when I was in bankruptcy. And I go, so that's 6 years. And I've spoken to my neighbors, and that deck was built a long time ago. That, to my understanding of the state statutes, just can't be torn down. Like, that's just part of the property. We don't want anyone here playing attorney. This is a litigated issue. When was the work done? When do people know about the work done? But if you see, you get your tax assessor's sheet, and you go, okay, I've got a 50s Cape and no deck. You've got a deck that has got years on it. You know, it doesn't have Trex decking on it. It's an older deck. Hey, Mr. Seller, when was the deck built? Oh, I don't know, it predates us and we've been here for 15 years. That deck's there. That statute has run as to whether or not a permit's required for that deck.
Same with the basement.
So this is the key.
That's the question.
This is the key. This is right here.
Finished basement.
Illegal use. So you have a non-permitted use, which is an illegal, an accessory apartment. It's a two-family and it's being used. There's no statute of limitations. I don't care if they've been using that as a guest bedroom since the house was built 50 years ago. That's an illegal use and there's no statute of limitations on that. This is really pertaining to, let's say, a basement renovation that was done 15 years ago.
Right.
The question is proving that. When was the work done? How do we get there from here? The building commissioner,
It was built in the 60s and the
Yeah,
basement has
1970
annually from the
split.
60s.
All these
there it is.
finished
So
basements.
let's just use that right there. House was built in the 60s, you got the paneling that was done in the 60s. Who's objecting to this? And if they are,
I did have a home inspector insisted that permits be shown.
let's talk
So I
about.
went to the city of Worcester and they said, you have got to be kidding me.
Yeah, thank you. That's, let's talk about that right now because it's really relevant for buyers. In talking to a lot of building commissioners, I think a lot of the panic is coming from the home inspectors. The home inspectors are seeing something, they want to bring value to their home inspection, and they're stirring the pot for sometimes things that we can't. They're creating fire. If it's Shrewsbury, Southborough, I can't put it out. You're right, there's no permits for my barn. Tell me what you want me to do. So, and that also is starting to creep into the lender appraisal process. And it's really important to understand when you're putting a listing together. Let's just say you've got a listing and it's got a decked out basement, gorgeous basement, flat screen, lighting, home theater, and the seller's like, yeah, I didn't pull any permits for this and I'm not doing it. I wouldn't put it in the listing. I wouldn't even mention the finished basement. Because what's going to happen is the home inspector is going to see this, the buyer is going to see it, the appraiser is going to see it, and they're going to say, where is this? And you can go as a listing agent, be like, it's not even in my listing.
Right.
You won't even see it.
The listing, the seller won't give you the listing if you won't put it in there.
But, all right, so let's follow that. So if you don't, who do you think, if this just happened in Westboro, who do you think is being sued right now for false advertising?
The listing.
Oh, is it you?
The listing.
Yeah, because you no,
Yeah.
you listed a property that you knew had an unpermitted
Yeah.
basement, you added value to the property. So yeah, you got the listing. What'd you get? And again, we play odds. I go, none of us can practice at the far ends of crazy buyers and sellers because we have them. Those are all the fun stories that can you believe that? Listen, our practice is not at the far left and the far right. It's at the bell curve in the middle. And that bell curve, most of these are going to be, oh, we need to close out some roofing permits. Oh, there's an issue. Let's go to Fred. Let's get this matter resolved. and without making a fire that we can't put out. Are we going to have those fringe issues? We are. But having items with respect to that finished basement, that gorgeous finished basement, it's going to get flagged. And the bank is not going to, the bank's going to
What if the basement was
eject.
finished when the house was built, but they didn't keep it good enough records at the town hall, they
Right.
have the permit from the house being built, but
Right.
not accurate enough or
I think-
enough to say the basement was finished.
Right.
What do you do then?
This is the conversation. And just be like, hey, listen, there's no permits for this.
Right.
We can't necessarily show that we can give you one. I can't give you those permits for my barn. But we can talk about it and say, hey, listen, you know, I can't make this permit happen.
But it's it's in the town of Grafton.
I do have to say something, sorry.
Don't do anything in Grafton.
Yeah.
You're on camera.
The fire department was in Grafton, this is the problem, the fire inspector's coming down. to
That's
the
right.
fence, And he's calling, and I had this happen to me, he literally called Bob Berger.
Sure.
And he came down, well, we were in the middle of the fire inspection, and said, we don't have a permit for this bedroom.
Wow.
They had permits, but they shouldn't have been using it as a bedroom, so it was clarified. However, that's what's happening, so.
And so that's a perfect illustration of being ahead of the problem.
Even if you don't list it though, I mean, just saying, even if you didn't list that down there, now we're having the fire inspector call Bob Berger and tell him that, hey, we have a basement down here, there's no permits.
Be careful, if
now
I may
what?
interject,
Yeah, please.
just be careful with that one. Basements,
Now what happens?
well, finished basements are one thing, I mean, those things happen. And actually, that phenomenon, if I recall, we saw a real uptick on finished basements after 9/11. And I suspected a lot of people were staying home rather than going out, so they started expanding into basements. So we didn't see as many finished basements until 9/11, to be honest with you. But be careful with bedrooms, that's the only reason I interjected there.
Thank you.
If you have a bedroom and a basement, if you're not sure about that, I don't care if you have a permit, don't have a permit, want a permit, don't want a permit, be very, very careful there, because that's a huge life safety thing. So if you don't have the appropriate emergency egress and smokes and carbons down there, I wouldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
no,
I would
they just
suggest,
shouldn't have been using it as
They-
a bedroom,
well, yeah, but that's
they
a,
just had it set up wrong.
yeah, but, see, the code has actually changed, the building codes have changed to address that slightly. Previous to, 2000, I'll get the dates wrong, but the mid to late 2000s, and certainly today's code, and anything in the last 6 years or so, you have to have emergency egress out of basements, just for that fact. Because the code understood that people were gonna use basements for sleeping areas, regardless if they said they were gonna do it or not. So and even if it's an older structure, basements, can start to get entrapment of people, so you don't, if they're used as sleeping areas, you wanna make sure it's done code compliant. So to be honest with you, I would have them pull a permit, even if it's a retroactive permit, and to make sure that those issues are addressed. Because
No, they had the
They
permit,
pulled it
they
from the
didn't have it,
franchise.
but they just had a bed in there, which they shouldn't have had in the
well,
road,
yeah, but see
basically.
that,
If we had
Well-
just said, take the bed out of there before they came, it would have been fine, you know?
yeah, you say that, but
Yeah.
unfortunately, people are gonna use that.
That's right.
though. You should, the potential is there, so really, if a basement's finished, under today's code, there's two big things. It's the emergency egress,
Right.
and it's the smoke carbon detectors. Carbon monoxide detectors are actually retroactive. Since 2006, every residential structure in the state of Massachusetts requires carbon monoxide detectors. That's hard and fast. It's one of the few building code issues that's retroactive. Matter of fact, it's probably the only one that was 100% retroactive. So if you walk in, you'll never get what they call a 26.5 F from the fire department's resale inspections without carbons in there. Now, it depends on if they're hardwired, not hardwired, there's a whole big thing on that. But if I'm listing that, I wouldn't touch a bedroom in a basement without having a permit. I wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. Too much liability in my perspective.
What if a house was originally built with no egress from the basement at all?
Well,
And it's a fairly new house.
oh no,
It's only
again,
14 years old.
yeah, at 14 years old, it wouldn't need it under the building code at that time. It wasn't actually required. It's only the more recent codes is basements actually have to have emergency egress. So I've had some knuckleheads finish basements and call them storage. So I'll actually list it on the permit, and this is previous to now, we're going back a few years. I'd actually risk only storage, only not to be used as habitable space. So if you have documentation to that fact. Same way with bedrooms, to be honest with you, in basements, I would typically today, we'd list them as not to be used as sleeping areas. So we used to stamp the plans all over the place and say not to be used as sleeping areas. So if you're gonna finish a basement, a lot of times we'll put that caveat in there as well.
Which is
So-
what they did at the end.
You can't stop somebody from using it as a bedroom, but if you document it, then it kind of takes all the liability off of us, off of you, whatever.
And just to jump in, I know there's a lot of questions, but just to jump in on that basement, you know, you've got to be ahead of these things. So that living space in a basement, oh no, we don't use it. And I had a situation where someone literally walked over to the sofa and pulled out the sofa bed. Oh yeah, no one's living down, like, why is this bed here? This is a bed, you know, it's not compliant. And it's, again, if you have that listing, you know, it's being aware of those situations and getting ahead of things. And that way, we're not at the purchase and sale where we have some of the issues. Just because on time, I just want to hit on purchase and sale items, and then we can circle back with some more questions. So I should have handed them all out, but if you don't mind, if you could just pass these around. On the last page, really, of my handout, this is what I'm seeing as attorneys. So either we use typically an attorney's version of the Greater Boston Standard Form, which is what I use for my contract. It's a little lawyered up, but it follows the template of the Greater Boston Form. And what I've been seeing consistently from buyers' attorneys is more and more, and I think you've all seen it here, long addendums. I mean, we have Boston firms that are literally more than doubling the purchase and sale agreement for a rider. And this is some of the language that they're putting into these riders. Seller has no knowledge of open building permits. In the event there are any such open building permits, seller shall obtain final sign-off by the inspector for said open permits. If you have that listing, that can be amazingly expensive for your seller. And I would go right to the buyer's agent and I go, what open permits are you referring to? Because you've checked and you know there's none. This is an open-ended question. So this is mandating that the seller close out any open permits. Well, what if they're in Southborough and there's no record for the barn? In my case, there was an open electrical permit for the underground. We had pulled it, but it wasn't closed out. So now do I have to dig a trench and have it re-inspected? That's what the contract says.
Well, so what do?
You don't have your client sign this.
You wanna sell the house.
Change the word.
Well, no, this is for the seller.
Change the wording.
We changed the wording. The second example, seller shall obtain a final sign-off from the inspector for said open building permits. Again, what open building permits? In the event seller has caused work to be done to the premises without obtaining requisite permits, seller shall obtain final, and it's a warranty. The beginning of that paragraph, one word, seller warrants. This provision shall survive the purchase and sale. Now you have an open contract with respect to any open building permits forever. What I do is when I see those provisions, I strike them 100 times out of 100. I take a very hard line on this. I get into it with buyer's attorneys, and I go, listen, I'll have the seller represent to their knowledge, to the best of their knowledge, and without any obligation on the part of the seller to investigate or check anything, that during their ownership, they didn't install new decks, porches, electric panels, structural renovations without obtaining a permit. And I'm like, this is not a representation or a warranty, and this shall not survive. And I get a lot of pushback. but I am steadfast on this. If I'm representing a seller, there's no way I'm adding this. And if I'm a buyer, I have language that is reasonable so we can get, if there's open building permits, like, so if I'm on the buyer side, I'd be like, hey, Katie, did we check the field card on this? Do we know if there's open permits? Because if there are, I want them identified and listed just like I did in Framingham. Yep, we've got an open siding permit, an open roofing permit. We're going to close those out, and that's in the contract. Done. These are the languages that, and again, I don't want anyone here playing attorney. Don't. You've got enough. Your job is to get clients. Let's get deals open, closed, make things happen. But just like keeping an eye on your mortgage commitment dates, this is the issue. There's nothing else in my purchase and sales other than like, okay, there's some repair items, there's some credit items. I'm dealing with purchases, permits, 1 out of every 10 to 15 deals. Why? Because I'm trying to get everyone to work off the same script. I want listing agents to check the jacket. I want buyer's agents to check the jacket.
What if the building department won't give you a copy or let you look at the jacket?
Won't let you look.
It's public record.
Yeah.
Well, then you can talk to your buddy in Grafton.
I don't, and I know this. Bob won't give you the jacket.
No, I won't give it to you.
He won't let you look at it. You can say, can I look at that, or can I get a copy, or, yep, no.
Put a
Okay,
record,
then.
put a public records request in. It's public record.
Yeah.
That's all I can advise you on that
3
one.
times now for different occasions, and they wouldn't give it to me.
So are you dealing with Bob? Are you dealing with Katrina? Are you dealing with Bill?
Jim?
Tim?
On the
Sure.
left-hand side,
Yeah.
yeah.
See if Katrina will give it to
I've
you.
never been there when I go.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
I called before too, and they said, no, when you get down here. Okay, but then I get down there, and you don't even let me look at them.
So is this for a listing or a purchase?
Some listing from purchase.
So if it's a listing, like if you were getting that type of flack from the inspector, I'd have the homeowner say, like, this is my record.
Yeah, because I said, if it wouldn't be too much trouble, can I look at that or get some copies? Yeah, it's too much trouble. Okay then.
Oh, wow.
And just be like, I'll make copies right here.
Erica, I know Katrina.
It's like,
Yep.
I would think.
But that's really, I want to end on purchase and sale because I want us to get us over that threshold. I want to get these properties sold. Your sellers want to sell. Your buyers want to buy. This is it is an issue and can be a real mess in the middle of the deal. There's some challenges here with respect to offers. Okay, Mike, we want to buy the house in Southborough, but there's no open permits. And my buyer's nervous. Call me. This is what I do. Let's rephrase the offer. Let's work on that offer language now because we want to get that offer accepted. And if you are like, oh, we need these closed out permits, maybe your offer doesn't get accepted. And the market's shifting to a degree, but it's still relatively speaking a seller's market. So we have to be conscious of that. But it's a conversation. It's a conversation with the buyers. It's a conversation with the sellers. And it's understanding that sometimes we can't produce the permit that people are looking for. And it's understanding that goes, okay, well, Shrewsbury is my best example. They have really inconsistent records there. And I go, listen, I call it a permit hunt. Now we're going on a permit hunt. Great. What happens when we don't find it? Now everyone's upset and we've wasted this time and energy. Let's talk about it. What do we want to do here? Is it a Fonzie apartment? Is it an accessory dwelling? We might need to get a permit. Yeah, let's make sure we do. All right, some questions.
Yeah, a couple of questions. First of all, to all my agents, when you have a bedroom and a basement, that's a red flag. Be very careful how you list that. I've had agents come to me and say, Chuck, it's a 5-bedroom system. I know I can put that in as a bedroom because they have that extra capacity. No, it doesn't meet code. It may not meet code for either smoke carbon monoxide
Right.
or exits. Be very careful. When in doubt, do not list it as a basement. Do not list it as a basement, because that's documentation that can come back to bite you. You represent it to someone that this is a 5-bedroom house and one of them are in the basement. God forbid there's a fire, somebody gets injured. We're in deep trouble, all right? But the question I have for you, Mike,
Yeah.
is as a buyer agent, all parties going into a transaction recognize that it's an unpermitted basement. all parties are going to accept that. But the buyer says to the buyer agent, does this affect my insurance at all?
To the best of my knowledge, this is a great question, and thank you, because I've heard this kind of anecdotally, that like, oh, the insurance companies won't cover this claim. I've heard that. I have never seen that in practice. I think where I always say, I invest in real estate, and one of the things is there's a lot, I look for multifamily homes. And there's a lot of Fonzie apartments that I look at, and a lot of Laverne and Shirley's. And if I had a buyer, Fred's looking at that house, and I go, listen, oh, you want that bonus bedroom? And I go, just so you know, if someone burns to death in that basement, if you think your insurance company is going to pay that, you're crazy. And I go, you have a high likelihood that you're going to jail. It was less than, I think, 3 years ago, there was the BU student that burned to death in an attic. Where do you, and that had just sold, that had been just inspected for fire and smoke. Where do you think that chicken is going to come home to roost? That's coming right to your doorstep. I cannot overemphasize, hey, listen, you've got that buyer, they want to accept it, you want to document it. With respect to their insurance, I think if they had any flooding issue, your typical homeowner claim, and again, I can't speak as an authority on this, but if they have your typical homeowner claim, that's not going to be an issue.
I'm thinking more of the catastrophic.
The catastrophic loss, if you think Amica or Geico is going to pay you a claim and pay damages to severely injured people and families, you're crazy. I mean, and I would say that right like that to my buyer. I'd be like, just so you know, you're on your own on this from an insurance perspective.
I was wondering, I'm having some of the same permitting issues, and we spoke a little before, so you're very helpful with what I have going on in Uxbridge. We just closed on a property in Blackstone, and as I was walking through, doing the final walkthrough, I noticed all these old crusty ionization smoke detectors everywhere. And I said, is there any, I called the agent, I said, there's no way you have the smoke search. She's like, oh no, we have it. So my investor, who's a builder, he knows the Mass Code, he active builder, he's like, there's no way. We went to the Uxbridge Fire Department and spoke to the chief, who said, I don't believe in making the people in my town invest extra money. If the bell rings, we give them a permit. So my builder says, what do I do? And I say, either A, we go after him for the money, because once you own the house, I don't care what the fire department says, if you have a problem, it's gonna come back on you, and God forbid, it comes back on me, because I can't find any way to stick my lawyer in here to put liability on him. So I just wanted to know from a building inspector's point of view, how can they do, how can Blackstone say that they don't need to even meet the state code? When we came back from the fire department, I was like speechless. I couldn't believe. I mean, they were, not only were they ionization, I took them down, they were older than 10 years old.
Well, yeah, so there's a couple points there. The photometric thing, that's kind of changed over the years. It wasn't until 98-ish, so you're talking about 20 years ago, that they come in that you needed photoelectric smoke detectors within 20 feet of a water source.
Yes, correct.
The code's kind of morphed in 2006-ish. It then went to that all smoke detectors had to be photometric. So generally what happens, and then the other point you raised is that by manufacturer recommendations, you'd have to look at the specific spec, but generally after 10 years, you're supposed to replace your smoke carbon detectors. The shelf life of those are typically around 10 years, give or take. So those are all valid points. And when you replace them, you should think about bringing them up to today's code. Now, what happens is a lot of fire departments will actually have a listing. So when it comes to re-inspections, it all goes by date. So prior to 1975, smokes they can be battery operated, they can be located in certain locations. Then from 75 to, I think it's 80 something or other, there's a different date. So they all go by dates on where the location of the detectors have to be and what type of detectors have to be. And so some of the, and to be honest with you, I don't know if Westboro actually has the listing of when those dates are, but that's kind of a guideline that a lot of fire departments will use. So depending on the date of the structure, they'll look to see where the devices are. what you're referring to is called a 26.5 F and a 26.5, I forget which is which. One's for carbon monoxide detection inspection and one's for smoke
They
detectors.
were all ionized, there wasn't one photoelectric in the house.
Yeah, that's
That's why-
probably, it doesn't sound like that would be correct, especially if they've been replaced.
Oh,
So, if nothing else, if that particular fire department, I don't wanna speak about any fire departments, because generally they're usually pretty good about, especially with those type of inspections. You either wanna talk to a builder or an electrician, because the electricians are up on a lot of the codes, and advise your homeowner that they have them updated.
I just advised them, you know, you price it out, I advise him once you close to
Yes.
upgrade to the proper photo, because he's a builder, so he knows, he's like, this should be photoelectric, and this should be this, and this should be that, so I just was wondering how that could have happened. how
Well-
finding out the,
Actually,
Smoke
most
service for-
times, in my understanding, you wouldn't be able to pass without a fire department inspection.
No, the fire department
And they let
inspected
it go.
it was just.
They let it go.
didn't-
And they let it go.
Yeah.
they let it go.
Yeah, that's, I mean, mistakes happen, I guess, but for your own perspective, you probably want to tell them to update it. Talk to an electrician and have them at least update what's there.
It's done.
Yeah, that it's done correctly. I mean, updating the whole house is a different conversation, but you would at least want to, for your own peace of mind, tell them to update it. Anyway.
I just,
I just want to say how relevant this is. This is so funny. I get a call this morning from a seller, and he's thinking about the spring or maybe now, and what's the price.
that's it.
And he said, Anne Marie, I've got one thing. Is it going to be an issue? I have an permitted room in the basement. So how perfect was this today to be here? Isn't that funny? So they're aware, you know,
Yeah.
he's aware.
More often than not, they are.
Yeah.
To be honest with you. Tell your clients too, the assessors will get you sooner or later.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, my God.
Over and over and over.
All the
I don't
time.
wanna call the
Permit, because
They're gonna get your tax dollars regardless if you get a permit or not. I hate to
thank
tell
you. I'm so glad you hit on that.
Of the like thousands of households every day that are replacing appliances and maybe half of them are gas replacements, how many permits really are pulled for appliance replacements?
Any reputable, to be honest with you, any reputable contractor will pull them. We get them a lot. We
Especially
do.
with gas. They're covering themselves.
Yeah, just a quick thing, Mike had hit upon the homeowners. So what happens in a lot of towns, the plumber or and/or electrician, they don't often do what's called standing the permit, the inspection. So a lot of times it's kind of up to the homeowner to be there to let the particular inspector in. So the ones that work in town regularly, they kind of get that arranged. I have actually had one electrician that refuses to call for the inspection and thinks it's the homeowner's obligation. You should get that straightened out with your whoever you're buying the appliance from. Just make sure that the permit's pulled, and if you're responsible for letting the inspector in, find that out.
Yeah.
So then you'll know if the inspector does show up. Because oftentimes, the plumber and electrician don't want to stay, and nor do you want to pay them $60 or $70 an hour to stand the inspection. So most inspectors are pretty good about that. They don't actually have to have the particular tradesperson there. Well, some towns are different, but generally, they'll go in as long as somebody will let them in. An adult, by the way, too. We will not enter a structure with teenagers. And I've had that happen, we just turn around. You've all been there, so. Anyway.
Fred, I just want to be very respectful of your time. So I just want to say thank you for everyone who came. I see a lot of these talks. I'm at a lot of these events. Some of them are really either off topic or pretty boring. I hope this was pretty interesting. I hope it was pretty on point. I have cards here. Again, call me on my cell phone if you have. These questions are happening now. This is live. This is action. This is something I have personally committed to. Fred and I got connected with that Westboro accessory dwelling unit. I handled that from a zoning perspective. I was able to produce all of the documents and forms that were filed with the town. You know, I always say for my tagline, anybody can do easy. You know, you have a nice friendly deal where everybody's working together. Anybody can do that. What I do is I can do the easy, but I can do the ones, oh, you need to go in front of a zoning board? That's something I can do. Oh, there's an issue with respect to permits. a land acquisition, merging properties, deeding things out. I do all of that. And I always say, you want to give the deals, the easy deals, give them away. But if there's a problem, those easy deals, they're going to drop you like a hot potato. Oh no, we don't know how to do that. This is all I do is real estate. And this was an issue that's been happening to both my sellers and buyers, and I kind of created this lunch and learn for just this issue. If you have issues, questions, buyers, sellers, call me. Let's talk about it. That's all. That's the best way to head these things off. And thank you very much for coming. Thank you for hosting me, letting me come.